You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on the show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the world's longest running show about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, here with an all-star cast. And we're going to talk about a really hot topic today, folks, unified analytics. Basically getting that 360-degree or 40,000-foot view, whatever you want to call it, of your organization. What's happening? Well, these days, there are so many data sources. There are so many tools and technologies. There are lots of different programming languages you can choose. There's generative AI you can use to create all sorts of things, including content, including code. That was my first observation when I played around with ChatGPT early last year as it cranked out all these articles for me. I'm just reading the stuff going, wow. And I thought, if it can write in English and Spanish and German, I'll bet it can write in COBOL and JavaScript and C++. And the answer is, yes, it can. We learned the other day, I think it was COBOL is what my buddy Malcolm Hawker was talking about. And he said that it wasn't in the initial training set. So it's like, well, how did it figure out how to write COBOL if it wasn't in the initial training set? And one answer is there are patterns. But we're going to talk about trying to get that clear view of your organization, despite having so many different tools, technologies, data pipelines, code bases. There are all kinds of things that can come into the mix these days, but you don't want that to muddy the waters. You want that to clear the waters, and you want to be able to see through and really understand and get some business impact from it. So we've got an all-star cast. Mark Palmer is back with us again, along with Ron Itelman and Juan Cruz Viotti. And let's just dive right in. Maybe, Mark, I'll throw it over to you first. I saw that article that you shared today about the disturbing part of what people are doing with generative AI. And of course, they're just grabbing it and throwing it out there in the world. And you might want to check that stuff, right?
Yeah, it might not be as disturbing as you might guess, but yeah, there's a great MIT study about generative AI and how it actually acts as a fantastic creative co-pilot for human thought and actually coding and writing and image generation. So I was fascinated by the study because I teach some courses about this and am involved in a lot of companies inventing technology in the space, of course. So I was really diving into the research, but I found something that was a little bit disturbing about the study, which is that in the study, of course, the way they did this is they had a number of subjects, over 100 subjects, do critical thinking tasks. So, and pretty complicated things like write a press release announcing a product. For HR professionals, they were asked to write a memo for a company announcing a return to office policy. For data engineers, they had them use it to generate a brief for how they'd explore data. So these weren't, simple tasks, but they were asked to use ChatGPT for it. And then the researchers studied the efficacy of the work that they produced. So they came out 44% faster and 20% better at their jobs. Unfortunately, 68% of the people in the study used AI's output straight out of the box without modification. A cynical friend of mine says that shows how that you should never underestimate how lazy people can be. I happen to think of it as just it's kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of how to really use generative AI and how it works, because of course we know it sort of guesses or estimates or
Right.
Predicts what it thinks you might be looking for. So
Right.
that was sort of the thing that we got started to talk about, which really is an interesting segue into the conversation about how to make the use of LLMs in an enterprise safer and more effective as well.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of the early story, and I'm a media guy, but I have a line about the media that the narrative is always wrong. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think it has something to do with just how the brain interprets information and the optic nerve flips the world upside down, right? I'm sure you know this, like a camera takes a picture and it's actually upside down. And so there's something about that that just infects the media writ large. And of course, we had this New York Times reporter engaging in some deep philosophical debate with ChatGPT where it asked him to marry him and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, that's a misuse of the technology. Like you're not using it for what it was intended to be used for. And that's why he went down a wormhole because he was trying to prove that maybe it's sentient or something. I'm like, all right, that's not a very responsible thing to do. But I don't know.
No,
What are your thoughts about that?
yeah, like it's an example of what Mark Andreessen calls this. He says to think of generative AI as as kind of an average or less than average human being when it comes to answering questions, right? It's really just guessing, right? And it's actually not too dissimilar. There's a fantastic new book out. The guys here that are joining us have one. This is another one I've been reading by Max Bennett. It's called A Brief History of Intelligence, and it really does a nice job of going through evolution and showing how the way that the brain developed is, of course, toward the end here, our last, actually since 1943, the research about neural networks, that's when it really started. Really, the system's designed to be like your brain, which is a guesser. It's a pattern matcher. It's a simulator of facts. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that it gets things wrong. However, we've all been trained to think that the computer just always gives us the right answer. So in
Right.
fact, it's quite different than the way we usually interact with computers.
Well, and so just to explain for our audience, there are these large language models. They weren't just trained on everything on the internet. That was one lesson they learned early on was, all right, we have to like focus and curate what we feed into this thing in order to get the desired results. And the same is true for businesses. So you can do a couple different things. I think the most common approach is this RAG model we've talked about, which is retrieval augmented generation.
Yep.
And I keep saying that the audit trail for enterprise use of these LLMs will be your embeddings. So the data that you feed your model, either by fine tuning the model or by building a vector database with these embeddings, that's going to be your audit trail. And that's really going to help stay aligned. But can you tell our audience what you know about RAG and how sophisticated it's getting or can get?
Yeah, it's if you look at all the major database companies, and I advise a number of them, including a company called KX. There's a company called Pinecone, Milvis. It's
Yeah,
one
yeah,
of
I
the
know
hot
them.
areas of investment in Silicon Valley and throughout the database industry. Basically, the idea is that RAG is a technique with these vector embeddings to take the secure, private, correct enterprise data that you have, unify it. So this is a great topic here to be discussing today with your guests. And then have that be the place where it brings out the factual information. My favorite example of this is, at a bank, if you ask ChatGPT, if you just go on to anything, Perplexity, Jasper, Bing, whatever, and just say, why did my portfolio decline last quarter? It'll give you a general answer. It'll say, well, it could be volatility in the market. It could be that the company, it'll give you something informative, but generic, right? But what most people want to do if they call their bank is know why their portfolio dropped or raised, right? And by how much. And it wants it to compare it to an index. It needs sort of that quality, that unified quality of information, the unification of my data plus the market data plus some context. And these are what vector embeddings do for you, is they encode that enterprise data in a way that the answers you get, while they may be creative or generative from a language perspective, the facts that they use are actually accurate. So I do believe that this is one of the keys for enterprises doing generative AI right, because when you start to have a trusted source of data combined with the creativity that you can get out of neural networks,
Right.
you really get a very, very powerful and accurate co-pilot.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Let's bring in Ron Itelman, dialing in here from the Denver area, I believe. Ron, tell us a bit about your book. I love the title. I love the message. It certainly fits with our show topic today. Tell us about your new book and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so shameless plug here. We wrote Juan and I wrote Unifying Business Data and Code. It's coming out next month. It's an O'Reilly book, and it was really a dream for myself to get to work on a book. I've been wanting to do so for a while. I think the most important story I can share, just to kind of kick us off, and I'll try and connect it with what Mark said, is that people ultimately want that personalized information to help them solve their problem. And so organizations invest a tremendous amount of resources and money to collecting this data. But what happens for a mysterious reason is once we get into these large scale collaborative systems that organizations are, with maybe a few hundred, a few thousand, or tens of thousands of employees, is silos start developing. And there are differences in language. And there's this weird paradox where you have your business executive who wants to know what decision to make for where to make an investment. It's a very high level. But then you have someone at very like low level working on code who has to actually define all of those concepts that are used in the decision and encode those in a way in a database. And unfortunately, the gap between that low level and the top level is incredibly high. And because of that, there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity, tremendous amount of assumptions, which leads to misunderstandings and mistakes, which are extremely costly for organizations. So an example is the word revenue. I had a coworker I'm fond with had this huge client who basically, and when I say huge, I mean these are one of these, multinational organizations where the sales team would count whatever the sales they had made as revenue. The accounting team wanted to deduct, and we're thinking more of a net revenue, the salesperson's commission from the definition of the word revenue. So you had two competing definitions of one very simple word. And now imagine you're a business intelligence analyst and the CFO wants a report on revenue, and you don't know what is the context of that one simple word revenue when they say, get me a report on, last quarter's revenue. And if that CFO is then going to make a $10 million, $100 million decision based on this report, they can make a wrong decision based off of one word. And so the challenge that I think we kept coming back to is, well, how do you connect? How do you unify? How do you align people and data and technology? Because if you only focus on the high level strategy stuff, you're not gonna reach that low level. And if you only focus on it as a technology problem, you're not going to reach that high level. And so how do we reshape these issues around data and knowledge and decision-making in organizations to really say we have to be thinking about both perspectives and get them to be on the same page in how to approach this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make an excellent point here that the attenuation of power and vision and direction from the top all the way to the bottom is very significant. And I'm reminded of this, I think, a poem by William Butler Yeats where he says the falcon cannot hear the falconer because it's just gotten too crazy. And that's kind of where we are at these days. That's the point I was making at the top of the hour about so many different tools and technologies and data pipelines and databases and analytic tools, business intelligence, machine learning, of course, gets baked into it, and different languages for solving things. Because just as in the human world, a different language isn't just a different set of words for the same things. There are idiosyncrasies about the languages. There are gaps. I mean, I talked to a compiler. There was a guy who ran CompilerWorks, one of the smartest guys I ever talked to. He's talking about the gaps in functionality between one language and another. And when you compile for a certain operating system, you can't be sure that everything is going to work out properly. So they have to actually dig into the weeds and figure that stuff out. And that gets pretty darn complex. So being able to even explain the code base and how it relates to the vision of the senior executives, that's a challenge in and of itself, right?
Yeah, this is and I really want to make sure I can explain this in a digestible way because it is perplexing to me, and it is infuriating, but it is absolutely so critical. So if we think about the business intelligence analyst at the end who has to create the report, and we say, okay, well, you need to have really good data quality or really good data to get an accurate report. Well, how does that data get generated? Which data? Why? So you have to go actually one step before the data.
Yeah.
And we call this the concept compass, because if you, without any technology, this is just on a whiteboard. If you literally say, give me your definition of the word revenue or whatever else you want in this report, and you talk to all the different teams and you write down their definitions, you will clearly see where things are not aligned.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just among, can we get people to even agree what this word is? Now you throw in the different databases, the different languages, the different technologies, the different experiences. It's just exploding amounts of potential for effectively corrupting the quality of your data. So we call this data hygiene. And the story is Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1860s, I think, he was able to reduce the mortality rate in the maternity ward from 18% down to 2% by simply getting doctors to wash their hands.
Wow.
Meaning, what was happening was the doctors were giving classes to other medical students on cadavers
Oh.
and then going to operate on women and deal with very, obviously at the time pre antibiotics and everything, childbirth, and they had an 18% mortality rate. Well, in the maternity ward run by women, they only had a 2% mortality rate. And so he wanted to understand why. And it's because they weren't teaching these classes in the cadavers. Now, he didn't know what germs were there at this time.
Yeah.
So he came up with like incorrect explanations as to why. But that's really been a guiding principle for me and Juan, are what is as simple as washing hands that will enable an organization to massively reduce the potential for, we can call it infection or whatever, but data hygiene is this term of we want to have clean data. How do we
Yeah.
wash? How do we do something as simple as washing hands?
Yeah, I like this. So washing your data, cleansing your data, checking your data, just making sure one last step before you load it. Just make sure, triple check, make sure that stuff is accurate. Well, folks, this is fascinating already. Don't touch that. I'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking to an all-star cast about analytics, data hygiene, data management principles. This is a real thread that we've been picking up on the last few weeks that guess what? For AI to work well, you need really good data hygiene. You need to curate, govern, focus, understand, have checklists to make sure that your data is what you think it is, and wash that data like you wash your hands if you're a doctor. But Juan Cruz Viotti, tell us your take on all that.
Yeah, so I would like to come back to something Mark said at the beginning of the episode. Mark said that to have a good AI pilot, you actually need good data to be able to power that. And that small implication is actually a very complex problem. And this comes down to the core, to the thesis of our book, in Unifying Business Data and Code, because a lot of what we are teaching in the book is even before technology, even before you even consider a technology programming problem, a solution to your problem. You have to come back to the basics. You have to make sure that you're actually doing the right thing that you should be doing. Are you actually doing it in the right way? Are
Right.
you removing the ambiguity from the data that you are managing? Are you aware of the knowledge gaps that you have and how to address them? Are you aware of the blind spots that you have? And coming back to Ron's maternity ward analogy, we can think about these ambiguity, knowledge gaps, and blind spots as the invisible germs of data, I guess, in this era. But that's essentially the essence of our book. We want to teach you how to go back to the basics, how to make sure that you have the data quality that you need to provide, giving you key principles so that you can follow these in any type of data that you have. Otherwise, the consequences of not following these principles is what we call garbage in, garbage out. And also one of the phrases that we thrown in the book is that your AI is only as good as your data. So there is a lot of work around that, and that's mostly what we cover in the book.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I mean, in a way, it's a bit frustrating because we're again talking about the basics, but the old problems persist, and it's just simple things sometimes when the integration was set up, perhaps when the model was designed, where the data came from as you loaded the data, for example. I mean, there are lots of things that can go wrong, but we do have a lot more tools to be able to help us. Observability has come to the fore, I think, in large part because of Kubernetes and the dynamic change that brought to how you design and deploy enterprise software, which is just a sea change. It's completely different in terms of how you do things. So we're just trying to understand what's going on. But I do think that machine generated data tends to be pretty clean. In other words, it has a certain structure and machines don't lie. Machines don't really make mistakes either. Quite frankly, machines just do what they're told, and sometimes it's a very complex process. But do you find that machine generated data is not as susceptible to misuse or to errors as human entered data? What do you think?
I think the problem has two layers because even if we say that machines can produce correct data, right? They do not make mistakes. They are obeying the orders of a human being that is asking them what to do. And
Right.
that person that is leading the conversation and asking the machine what data they want out of that, they might have their own ambiguity, knowledge gaps, and blind spots that they are not realizing that they're introducing in the question that they're asking the machine, right? And you see all of these, for example, talks or articles I've seen studying how humans end up introducing their own biases, for example, into machines through AI. So I don't think that that fixes the problem per se, because again, machines are not making decisions on their own. There is always a human being on the driver's seat in some way or another, and that human being is still susceptible to the same problems that might translate anyway.
No, it's a very, very good point. Well, and kind of getting into the deeper side of this and understanding and unifying business data and code as your book suggests. What's really cool about the Gen AI stuff is that you can use it to explain code. You can use it to explain paradigms and methodologies. Again, you got to check it and make sure that what it's coming back with is accurate. But what I've seen so far in the Gen AI world is if you are asking it questions about topics that are widely published, such as how a router works or how computer servers work or things of this nature, it's pretty accurate because it has enough information upon which to base its statements or its predictions, is really what it boils down to. Now, stuff on the edge, stuff that's pretty obscure, it's going to be a little bit harder. And if you try to ask it for hard details of things it doesn't know, well, then you're going to have some serious problems. But this Gen AI stuff can really help facilitate the process of unifying data, business, and code. What do you think?
I think so. Oh yeah, go ahead,
Oh no,
Mark.
go. Well, I was just going to add. It's interesting you say that because another great use of generative AI that I do all the time and a lot of is to search for counterfactuals, is to be the devil's advocate, right? Because it's actually quite good at doing some reasoning about the logic flaws. So, for example,
Right.
I'm constantly putting in things that I write and say, argue this from the other point of view. This is one that Mark Andreessen talks about a lot, which is one of his favorite ways of using generative AI. Put it take the perspective of someone like Albert Einstein. How would he critique this? Or someone more, someone creative like Rick Rubin, one of my favorite latest creative folks, right? So one of the powers there is to play devil's advocate. And in fact, I really loved Ron's idea of the concept compass, right? Because that's what you're talking about in the early stages, right? Is get your bearings first. Look for holes in your logic before you dive into the data. Like, am I asking the right questions? Do I have the right data? This
Right.
is a great use for generative AI to be sort of the a sounding board for looking for flaws in your thinking about even the direction. Because of course, the beauty of the analogy of the compass is that basically. If you set off in the wrong direction with the, then whatever data you have is going to get you there, right? So orienting yourself first is, I think, a really powerful way to even use the hallucinogenic capabilities of AI, because it'll find things that you might not expect.
That's a very interesting point. And, I'm reminded of experiences I've had in driving cross country. And there's almost nothing worse when you're doing a long road trip to driving in the wrong direction, just getting on the wrong and expressing the wrong direction. Like, oh no, now I have to go. I first have to get to the next exit. Then I got to turn around and go back all the territory I just passed and then get back to where I was before. Oh my goodness, it's so frustrating.
Yeah, so you can have perfect fuel in your tank, but if you're heading the wrong direction, who cares, right? So that's why I think maybe that's an area of focus when I get the Ron and Juan Cruz's new book. That I think I'm going to be interested in that section for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe Ron, I'll bring you back in to comment on this. If you're talking about unifying data, business, and code, you're really talking about code literacy and data literacy across the enterprise, right? And I was talking with a couple experts recently about this, and what's going to be very interesting about this new paradigm of AI infused workflows is that I think you're going to see organizational charts collapse even more than they have. And what I mean by that is we're going to have more collegial environments where it's not so much top down hierarchies that no one really likes. I mean, I don't think anyone likes to be in a top down hierarchy, right? We all want to feel like we're on a team working together. And I feel like what you're talking about, Ron, can facilitate that because when people understand what you do for a living, let's say you're all in the same company, when they really understand and they see what you do and they see how it's done, that's very educational and that really helps build empathy. So then they're not so suspicious. But when you don't know how other people operate, you tend to be suspicious, like, oh, what is he doing? Is he just sitting around all day watching TV? When you know what the job looks like and have a better understanding, it's very helpful to then foster collaboration and communication. What do you think, Ron?
Yeah. So my God, I already have like 20 topics here written down. I'm going to try and connect it. So let me go back to the beginning of this conversation when Mark introduced this MIT study and people copying and pasting. This is actually a really good a good way to ground us in like what human behavior is very typically, outside of even the Gen AI thing, right? People aren't questioning the assumptions. They're certainly not wanting to challenge the hierarchy in these organizations, as you talked about, Eric, with these like,
Right.
really, right. So a lot of the times there's just this copying of, oh, that's what my boss said I should do, or that's what the policy is, right? And if you question those things, you're quite often maybe a troublemaker, right? Rabble rouser. And so a lot of the book is around, we call it the data champion, which is there has to be a way for an organization to have a transparent and frank conversation around how do we actually, if the world is moving towards an AI first business paradigm, right? We need this data quality. We need to have our concepts aligned. How are we going to collaborate together to build those kinds of systems? How are we going to understand each other? And so, the world currently has agile, quote unquote, and using the go back to the car analogy, well, agile is like go, go, go. What's the quickest way? Do your 2-week sprints and your, stand-ups. But the number one complaint we would get is, well, how do you know you're even going in the right direction?
Right.
Right. And then you got to turn around and go back. So it's incredibly wasteful. And the reason the concept compass came up is because too often I would see organizations, literally some higher person with no data literacy makes a decision, here's check for $15 million, go. And people will be starting to build things without even agreeing on the fundamental levels of, what's the North Star? What does success look like? How do we define things? And so I feel like I've been talking a while here, but I just want to make sure I capture back to something Mark said when he talked about people wanting to know their portfolio, whether it's successful, is like, well, comparing it to an index. And this is actually an incredibly powerful tool way of thinking, because what that is it gives us a shared reference frame, right? So if I ask, what's the tallest mountain? You might think it's Everest. Well, is it Everest? It is if you measure it according to sea level. If you don't measure it to sea level, then there's a mountain in Hawaii, which starts at the ocean floor, which is, I think, almost twice as tall as Everest, right? So there's really no better way to start thinking about in these collaborative systems with the hierarchies that you were alluding to, Eric, than to start defining as measured by what.
Right.
And that's the critical, I think, after all that huge story, I think that's where I was leaning to. Yeah.
It makes sense. And Juan, I'll throw it back over to you. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have the human conversations with each other to understand what to tell the machines to do. And that's one of the most important things. And communication is hard. I mean, when we talk to each other, there are so many assumptions that go in to the context, to the purpose, to what we're talking about, to the meaning of the words, all this stuff. And to Mark's point earlier, it's very useful to hash that stuff out and get the devil's advocate view, because there may be something that you just don't understand. And it does take maturity and professionalism to know when you have to ask someone if I'm correct about something, and not to be afraid to do that, right, Juan?
Yes, that's correct. And to make the problem even worse, I think these invisible germs, I guess going back to the analogy that we see with all of this ambiguity, all of this confusion that you're talking about, Eric, the worst problem is that they grow exponentially. At the beginning, things are kind of okay, and there is a bit of ambiguity and bit of problems and confusion in there. But then you keep making decisions on top of the same things that were ambiguous before, and then on top of that, and then on top of that, and then other teams, for example, might be making decisions based on what you've said, but then you are not even aligned yourself, and that cascades all over an organization to a point that it's impossible to go and make progress. And this is even leaving data aside, right? Even I guess like political stuff within a company can be just full of confusion. So
Yeah.
going and reverting that problem is even worse. And I think here we have the problem even twofold. Because we do not only have to reduce the ambiguity, the knowledge gaps, and the blind spots in communications between humans, but we also need to encode this disambiguation on our communication with machines as well, on both sides. And that adds a whole another facet on it. And that's where, for example, the main thing that I'm working on with Run on Intelligence AI is how do we translate all of these lessons from applying the methodology of the book of actually aligning people purely at the human level, right? How do we encode all of these insights at the machine readable level as well, right? And one of the core insights that we have that we have talking about language, which is something that you mentioned, Eric, it is impossible to align either people or machines and people or machines to machines if we're not all talking the same language. So one of the main things that we're doing in the book is defining what we call a universal language for data, and that's what we're basing around the JSON schema, organization, and open source specification.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff, I have to say. And our break is coming up here in just about 45 seconds, but I want to talk about where I'm kind of going with all this stuff and where I see it coming together. And we'll talk with Mark and Ron and Juan about that in the final segment here today, or the final live segment, which is that I think large language models are going to become the interface for all executive interaction, certainly. But you need to have all these other systems around for the trusted records, if you will, or the systems of records, your ERP system, uh, uh, your clickstream analysis system, your data warehouse. All these things are going to feed into it, and it's going to be an interesting RAG model that comes into play to make sure that you're getting accurate information. But folks, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio. What a fantastic conversation with Mark Palmer, Ron Itelman, and Juan Cruz Viotti. And we want to sum things up here and kind of weave it all together, unify the analytics, if you will. And like I was saying, I believe that large language models, OpenAI with Microsoft, Anthropic has Claude, Google has Bard or Gemini, I guess they're calling it now. I believe this is the future front end, at least for certain people in the business, senior executives, for example. But you're still going to have all these systems of record behind the scenes. And I think it's going to take an interesting RAG model to be able to piece this all together and enable executives to ask very deep questions about what's happening in my business right now. What can I do to improve things? And it's going to reach across and all these different systems and figure it out. And what I think is really fascinating, and why I think analytics is frankly in the crosshairs of these LLMs, is that large language models don't care about inner joins and outer joins and things of that nature. They just go out and find stuff and fuse it together. And they seem to be pretty darn good at doing that. So is that going to disrupt the analytics play in general? I'm very curious to see how this all pans out. But Ron, Itelman, closing thoughts from you.
So we have this, during the break, we kind of talked about like, defining success. I think you mentioned, Eric, and it was a very simple set of principles you talked about. And I just actually want to talk about that because that's very aligned with our approach. The first thing is I want to talk about what is knowledge, because you hear knowledge graphs and we use the term knowledge a lot, but there actually is like a very formal definition in our book, which is knowledge is the data that you need to solve your problem. If you have data without the context of the problem or goal, it's just information. What turns it into knowledge is, I want to meet my sales quota. What is the information I need in order to move me there? So we call these success spectrums. And knowledge is what helps push you towards the next most desirable state. The reason that I bring this up is because what you said is so fundamental, Eric. It's literally, can you define what success is? What is the information you need and why? And even though this may seem, people want the really fancy high-end stuff, which please, by all means, go and do that because it is the future, is extremely powerful. However, if you as a leader cannot define what success is, how are the people underneath you or the people working for you or your team that you're working with going to possibly deliver that?
Right.
There's just far too much ambiguity. So my recommendation, I guess, to listeners around analytics is there are some things you just have to define. You have to define what success looks like. How is it measured? What is success? And so if your KPIs are going to be the measurement or the metric, and your OKRs or objectives and key results are going to be like, okay, what level of that KPI constitutes I've succeeded at my goal? That's just such a fundamental thing. And yet, unfortunately, I've seen it not done over and over again.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I've seen it too. And Mark, I'll throw it over to you. One of my old bosses, one of the best bosses, probably the best boss I ever had, really, really nice guy, Peter Quinn. He was the general manager for TDWI when I worked there back in '05. And he would have this expression, he would say, let's achieve what we're trying to achieve. And that just cracks me up. It's so simple, but it's like, oh yeah, stay focused. What were you trying to achieve? Stay on that. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, we've talked about washing your hands and finding the compass, right? So, but I want to bring that back to how you frame this, which is this the era of democratization of interfaces where everybody gets their own compass, if you will, and we start breaking down those hierarchical barriers that Ron is speaking of. Satya Nadella, when he spoke at the OpenAI Day, I loved his perspective, which is that we're reimagining the way we write code, the way developers and technical people, and I think indeed any person interacts with information through LLMs, yes, with RAG, but also with I think the most overlooked innovation of generative AI as we use it is the prompt-based interface. And being able to use language to explain information is the thing that ultimately democratizes access to it. So we have I think that's as much of the breakthrough as anything, which is why it is so important to use trusted sources of data in the context of the decisions that we get. So yeah, I think for sure this is maybe one of the most important topics, because it's not what Satya said is that Microsoft is building their software now for not the tens of millions of developers that they have always developed software for, but for billions of people to use. I mean, it's a seismic shift in who's got their hands in the pie. And I guess we're going from tens of millions of people to have the compass to unify data to having billions. So we better get it right, because everybody's going to be heading in different directions. So I love that perspective, and it's a fun one to think about for the future.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do think that transparency is key in all that. Transparency is great for trust. I mean, OpenAI right now is not open. Ironically enough, it's a black box to a certain extent. And I think that may need some prying into. But Juan Cruz Viotti, I'll throw it over to you. Bring it all together, unifying analytics, unifying business code and data. What are your final thoughts?
So I think, as Mark said, everybody's going to have access to all of this data. For example, imagine in the context of a company, every employee in there has access to an LLM that has been fine-tuned to help them perform the tasks that they should be performed. But again, we keep coming back to the same problem, which is, has the LLM been fine-tuned with the correct data that actually aligns everybody on the right direction? And there are two sub-problems that I think I see with this, just to end up the discussion. One of them is that, first of all, for an LLM to be efficient at advising somebody at a company about what they should be doing, the LLM has to be aware of what's actually going on around the company. And then we get into the problem space of applying and installing all of these different sensors, I guess, around the company that are going to be measuring everything that's going on. They're going to be feeding back on the LLM, so the LLM knows at any given point in time what's going on, what might actually happen, so that they can advise people better, right? And once you have applied these sensors correctly, which is a whole problem on its own, we're talking about integrations, trying to, scan email conversations, chat, work that is going around in GitHub, I don't know, the multiple, data sources that a company provides. Then there is an interesting twist to all of this, which is that if there is an LLM that is aware of everything that is going on around the company because it needs all of this data to be able to advise people, could the LLM being, I guess, in a way more creative than the average human being, right? And what Mark was saying, you can actually exploit the benefits of the LLM, for example, asking it to give you counterfacts of what you're saying. Could the LLM, given all of this data it's sensing across the company, actually help you find out what your North Star should be by
Yeah.
treating the organization as an optimization problem? The LLM might actually know that better at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very interesting question that I asked myself, and I see you nodding your head there a little bit and furrowing your brow, Mark. So I think you're thinking about it as well. I mean, it could get really amazing in the fairly near future here, because you look at like what Gong can do, for example, or what Otter.ai does when it attends a meeting and it breaks down the whole transcript, it gives you the takeaways and all this stuff, and you're just like, that's pretty impressive, man. Now, still, the devil's always in the details, but 60 seconds, your final thoughts, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's already here. You're seeing the early forms of it. I literally use it every day. Seth Godin, one of my favorite authors of The Purple Cow and other great books on marketing, says that he believes that generative AI is underhyped.
Hmm.
And he says that because of what this segment is all about, right? Which is that when the iPhone was a lot of people compare this to the iPhone in terms of transformative power, right? But when the iPhone was released, people spent on average just a few minutes a day using their phones to access the internet. Now we spend hours, as we all know. And he believes that generative AI is underhyped because the same effect is going to happen. And now I teach a course about generative AI, so I'm already in that 4-hour camp some days. And this is one of the most powerful ways to, look for counterfactuals. find empathy, by looking at information from someone else's eyes, even someone who's not alive anymore, like great thinkers, right? So I would argue you can already do some of these things, and that'll just keep getting better and better and better as tools are developed that help us
I
make
think
this
so.
shift
I
in
think so. Yeah, what a wonderful show. You've been listening to DM Radio.
In the know.